get going now. This is for the Ward 6 City Council seat. This is voted on only by residents of Ward 6. Let me introduce first the incumbent City Councilor, Brenda Noel, who is seeking your second term, I believe. Let's try to hold the applause until after the forum. Brenda's been here for 10 years. She lives with her husband, and she has 15-year-old twin daughters. She's worked 25 years in public and nonprofit sectors, and for the past 6 years, she's worked at NWW Committee. That's a nonprofit here in Newton that provides housing and support services for people that have intellectual or developmental disabilities. And she currently serves as the executive director of NWW. And to her right is Lisa Gordon. Lisa grew up in Ward 6, and she now lives there as well with her husband and her 2 kids. She was a member of the Newton Center Task Force, and she co-founded the Friends of Newton Center and is now a director of Responsible Retailing Forum. So we'll get to it. We're going to try to keep the answers to about 30 seconds. We will leave room for responses, and then at the end, we will allow each of you to ask the other a question and then have a final closing statement. Let's start with our challenger, Lisa Gordon. Why are you running for City Council?
So I'm running for 3 main reasons. The first would be climate change. I think that we are in a time of crisis and that the city must look at climate change and be trying to strive to the goal that by 2050, we are carbon neutral. The second would be to maintain the excellence in our schools. And the third would be to continue the tradition in Ward 6 that we previously had of a responsive and accountable ward councilor.
Brenda, why are you running, and would you like to respond to Lisa's statement?
Sure. So I'm so excited to be running again. As you mentioned in my introduction, I'm a social worker by training, and I've had the benefit and the privilege of working for mission-driven organizations my whole life. And the opportunity to serve my community as a city councilor, what better way to be a member of my community, to espouse the values of our community, and to really live the value system that I believe in. I've worked really hard, and it's been a privilege to be able to hear from my constituents through newsletters, through monthly office hours, through a social media presence. I really am proud of my record with engaging with my ward.
Thank you, Brenda. Let's talk about some specifics in Ward 6. And of course, Ward 6 is elected by the residents of Ward 6, but you vote on issues that are involved in all of our 8 wards. You hear a lot of talk about the Newton Center triangle and it being perhaps a waste of space. I can say that there are many times where I see a lot of empty parking spaces in what we call the triangle. Let's start with Lisa. Would you support a redevelopment of the triangle? We sometimes hear perhaps that's a spot for a new senior center, it's centrally located, et cetera, or for some private redevelopment of the triangle. What are your thoughts on? Is it a wasted space?
Well, I guess it depends on who you ask, because the merchants that abut the Triangle parking lot do not feel that it is a waste of space. I had the privilege of serving on the Newton Center Task Force in the early 2000s, and we looked at that space in depth. I would love to see a playground or something similar to what they have in Post Office Square in Boston. We were told that that's just not feasible. In order to go down enough to make changing that lot workable, it would cost roughly, and this was about 15 years ago, maybe more, $50,000 a parking space. We were also told that the old school that was there, the Mason School, is partially buried under there so that it was geologically unsound to think about developing that space. So I think it warrants looking at it again, and if we could work out a way that would make the merchants happy and keep the Ward 6 residents happy, okay, I would absolutely support that. Councilor
Noel, redevelopment, whether private or public, of the parking lot in the middle of Newton Center. What are your thoughts?
I think the Triangle is an amazing opportunity. We have goals in our city around climate change. We have goals around increasing our walkability in the village centers. You know, I've knocked on doors on 2 campaigns now, and folks are frustrated with the banks, and they want some walkability. And, you know, anybody who has met me or talked to me, I'm all about opportunity. I don't take a no. You know, we can get there. Let's figure this out. So I'm excited about what we could do with the center. I would be open to the senior center. I would be open to redevelopment as long as it met our climate goals, as long as we were thinking about traffic mitigation, and if it increased our walkability. And, you know, I've talked to, you know, the administration. I've talked about undergrounding the parking. So I know there's concern about the parking, but I think there's a way we can figure this out.
All right, thank you, Brenda. Let's talk, you mentioned seniors, and there's a couple of areas we can get into, but let's start with Lisa. Lisa, what is the 1 or 2 biggest challenges facing senior citizens in the city of Newton? And it's a growing percentage of the population. In a few years, I think it'll be close to 25-30%. What are the biggest challenges facing seniors here, and how would you address those?
So I think we must keep in mind as well, there are all different types of seniors. So my mother is a senior, but my mother walks everywhere and is in, you know, so we have a varying degree of different types of seniors. I think one of the biggest issues is transportation, being able to get to places that they want to go affordably. So that is something that I think needs to be looked at. I think there are a lot of seniors who'd like to age in place, and I think for some, their money is caught up in their homes, and so that's something that needs to be looked at. And I would love to see that the city take on the role of helping seniors who'd like to age in place, be able to do chores, be able to do the things, shovel their walkways if they want. Additionally, we need to look at housing. We need to find a way where people who have contributed to our wonderful town, our city, we need to find a way where if they want to stay in Newton, but they don't want to stay in the houses that they had when they had their children, that they can
let me follow
live
up
in
on
Newton
that.
affordably.
What are some suggestions that you would have to, and then we'll let Brenda answer, obviously.
So I've been working with a developer in Newton Center who is putting in 55 and over housing in the middle of Newton Center. I think that's a wonderful idea, and I know that there are people who are already talking to him who'd like to downsize, who'd like to be in that. When I say affordable housing for seniors, I think we need to think really carefully about that. I was talking to someone this morning who felt that $6,000 a month in rent was an appropriate amount to charge a senior who is downsizing. I think that's way too much. So I think it is something where we need to look at private-public partnerships. We need to look at what we can do to honor the people who this community was built on their labors, and we are now benefiting from the money that they paid in to our taxes.
And Councilor Noel, along the same lines, what's the biggest challenge or two that seniors, and I realize they are it's a wide demographic. Someone 65 is certainly not the same as someone 95, but what are the general challenges?
Sure. So I would agree with some of the challenges that Lisa identified. I think the one that stands out to me when I knock on doors is just the isolation. That I'll knock on a door and someone will come, I'll meet somebody who is 88, 95 years old, living alone in a very large house with stairs. And, I met a woman recently who didn't have money for a home health aide. She literally was dependent on a relative stopping by once a week. So what do we do about that? Because these are really complicated issues. And the interesting stat I also learned is that people are not moving out of their homes at 65. They want to age in place. They want to stay in their homes, and that the statistic tells us that people tend to move out of their homes when a spouse dies. So it's happening closer to 80. I'm getting the red light. I can keep going on how I'd fix it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So it's complicated because people they want independence and they want to be able to stay in their homes. So I think we need to provide a couple opportunities. We need to be able to allow them to stay in their homes through services. I think NUMO is a step in the right direction. I know it's not perfect, but it's a step to have a transportation system. I think that we're working with, in the last budget cycle, we worked with the Council on Aging to come up with some services to really assess the isolation out there and what people need. And then there's a larger issue of housing. So I am an advocate. It's on my website. People know if they know me. I am an advocate for greater density in our village centers, for greater affordability in our village centers. And the formula to get affordability is directly tied into a certain amount of density. And I do believe our affordability needs to be built on the backs of developers.
Let's tie these, thank you. Let's tie these questions together. Do you think that the Triangle would be a good spot, perhaps, or a better spot for a senior center than the Albemarle Field location that seems to be resurfacing?
I do not think we should build a senior center on any parkland, so if you're relating that question, then yes, it is a better location. However, I think that the city should do what other places do, and we should be looking at what the ideal space is and acquiring that. I think that limiting ourselves to our parklands and to inappropriate places that may be too small is not the solution.
Do you think that there's a property that could be acquired? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think the city should have looked at where the former Apchugang restaurant is. $3.2 million. It's an incredible space.
That's the Four Corners?
Newton Four Corners. So I would be casting my net wider instead of forcing people to either give up a park or put the senior center in the Newton Center Triangle with all of the issues that have been researched numerous times over the last 20 years that I've actually spent a lot of time in Newton Center and Newton Highlands being a community activist.
Brenda, did you have a response to that?
Sure. So I would agree. I'm not comfortable with parkland being used for our senior center. I do think the Triangle is worth exploring. And the way I would look at that is, again, undergrounding the parking and then thinking about 2 to 3 stories up where we might have a senior center, some retail on the first floor, maybe business or housing on the third floor. It also is asking us to rethink our senior center in terms of, because the proposal that's on the table requires 3 acres of land. I think the thing about the Apung site is what we're up against is that we're looking for land that the city already owns. So we're not purchasing land in addition, because it's already going to be expensive. We've already talked about the price of undergrounding parking. So I think that we're either looking for land, and again, this is coming out of the mayor's office, but that the city owns, or that we can have some sort of negotiation or swap for.
All right. Let's stay in the area of Four Corners. There is a special permit application for a retail marijuana store right in that general area, a few hundred yards down, abutting Cold Springs Park, near where the old South Pacific used to be. Let me ask this to Lisa, how much control does the city council have in terms of determining how big, et cetera, or whether if that is even the appropriate location for a marijuana shop?
So the city has a lot of control here. We have the special permit process, and that is the tool that we use to assess whether something is appropriate. And in this case, my opponent has sent out in her newsletter that it's up to the state to decide, and if all the requirements are met, then it's a done deal. This isn't the case. We as a community and as a city council, we must look very carefully at this. It is very close to a playground. It is on 2 school walking routes potentially. It is, there's big traffic issues already at Beacon and Walnut. And if I were on the city council, I would be looking at these and saying, does this really meet the requirements of a special permit? And I don't think it does, and that would be the job of a city councilor. Councilor
Noel, your position on that?
Sure. First of all, I love that you're reading my newsletter, because I love that I'm getting out into the community. In terms of perhaps the interpretation of my newsletter, though, it's really the sightings of these locations, the guidelines are set by the state. The city council can interpret those guidelines and assess as each proposal comes before us, and that's our job. We should be doing that. But if we're not respecting the guidelines set by the state, we're running the risk of opening ourselves up to being sued. So I agree that that the city council is going to interpret those guidelines, and then the good news is we've got the special permit process to kick this around, where through the special permit process we can set things like appointment only, security guards, hours of operation. So we do have some tools in the toolbox to make sure that these establishments, if they meet the state requirements, are good partners in our community.
Lisa, you looked like you wanted to respond to that, or? My question with that, and I can ask you this, Brenda, and Lisa, you can respond, is parking would seem to be a real issue in that particular location, unlike Washington Street, where at least there's some
Sure.
parking available on the street there. There's very little. There's a small lot behind, and then you just run up against Cold Springs Park. What are your thoughts about how to mitigate any issues with parking in that spot?
So parking is a super interesting animal right now because we're really looking at parking in relation to what is the relationship between parking and traffic. And there's a lot of work I'm doing with my colleagues about pushing these special permits and changing some of our parking requirements, with the idea being if we can play with parking, we can address traffic. For that particular site, interestingly enough, there is actually more than enough parking as required by the permitting process. So it may seem like there's not a lot, but it well then meets the requirements. They actually have more parking than they need there for what they're trying to do. What we know and what we've learned from Garden Remedies is that appointment only works. It works to slow down traffic.
All right, very
Oh,
good.
I'm so glad you feel that way, since it was myself and a bunch of colleagues who pushed the appointment only. So that's wonderful to
done.
hear, because we
Let's-
feel strongly that should be part of every store that comes into Newton.
Let's stick with Newton Center and sort of expand it out into this whole citywide discussion that we've been having for several years about higher density development in and around the village center. So I'll ask Lisa. I can tell you from my eyes that Newton Center does seem to be a little quiet many times. Would you support multifamily developments around the village center and Newton Center, or what is your thought on that?
So it's interesting to me, I've just been recently hearing about how Newton Center isn't dense enough. Although Newton Center is probably the densest village center in all of Newton. We have lots of two-family homes. We have Weeks House, we have Castleman House, we have quite a few. That's not to say we're going to have the new 55 and over center that's moving in. So that's not to say that there couldn't be more appropriate housing and more appropriate and thoughtful projects in Newton Center. I think it's a little bit of a disconnect, this idea that the reason that Newton Center has so many banks and nail salons is because there isn't enough density. That actually is not the case. It has to do with the price of real estate and what the landlords can get for their businesses. So I would untie that. I see I need to stop, and that is a question I can go on and on about. So.
Brenda, why are there so many banks and nail salons in
That's
Newton
amazing.
Center?
That is an amazing question.
You need your nails done or to go to the bank.
Fair.
Which,
So this is a really complicated economic issue in terms of, the way we shop is different. I've been knocking on doors, and I cannot tell you, there's almost no doors that don't have an Amazon package on their front steps when I come up on the door. So we're shopping differently. The properties in Newton Center have been owned by the same people for a long time. So, and the value of those locations is very high. So you can demand almost anything you want for those rents. And banks are willing to sign long leases, and it's a sure bet. So in order to crack that code, to create some diversity, I think we have to go at it from many different levels. I can keep going if you
yeah,
want.
go ahead. I'll give you another 30 seconds. Some of those levels being.
So despite the apartment complexes that my colleague mentioned, which I think are amazing. I mean, Castleman's affordable housing, it's an amazing, it's a crown jewel. In terms of apartment complexes, I think we can do more. If you look on Langley is one story. What would happen if we made that 2 stories with housing on top? And also said to folks, we want you, this is housing, but there's no parking, so you can't bring a car. So you're gonna need to use the train, you're gonna need to walk around, you're gonna need to figure it out. And so then the idea is that those folks would then be shopping in the center. And then but the thing that we haven't, is complicated is how do we get the moms and pop stores back into Newton Center when they can't compete with the banks?
All right.
And that's a complicated answer.
Let me add, that's an interesting point you raised about building up. For example, Walnut Street in Newtonville used to have many of those stores, those older stores had a second level. And they came down, I believe it was during the Depression era when they were having trouble renting them out. But that's an interesting point, Lisa. I'm wondering what you thought of that in terms of you could create perhaps foot traffic and add some vitality by building on top. On Langley Road, you're talking about specifically, which is sort of set back from the traffic there.
So I just need to say I live 2 minutes from Newton Center, and I think Newton Center is awesome. And it does have its issues. It has way more restaurants. It went through a really terrible time in the late 90s and the early 2000s. But this idea that there isn't vitality, I take, it is. There's a lot going on. There used to be housing actually right in the middle of Newton Center. And the landlords decided that they could make more money by renting it out as office space. And so when I was on the task force, we looked at that. We kind of thought it would be great to bring the housing back in. So I like the idea of there being a mix. I don't think that solves all the problems. I also think the idea that you're going to rent apartments to people in Newton Center without cars and that that's somehow going to work is just not.
Let me follow up. I mean, if not Newton Center, where? Right?
I'm
Because if Langley Road is a 1-minute walk to the train?
Yeah, but I'm just saying there are people who live right in Newton Center now proper, and Vicki could tell you this, or other Ward 6 councilors, they're constantly looking for parking. They want a parking space. So even though they know when they move in that there isn't a parking space available, unfortunately, we are still a community that does rely on cars. I think a lot of people bike, and I think that's wonderful, and I think a lot of people use public transportation. And I, for one, am really advocating, I'd like to see some kind of transportation system that linked all the villages, because I think that we're sorely lacking in that. But I think people still bring their cars. And if we look at who moves here, it's families largely.
Councilor Noel, you had a counterpoint.
Yeah, I think this car thing is big, right? We've been talking about it a lot. So, we just released this amazing climate action plan that the citizens put together, and the administration also have one. And we just learned 28% of our greenhouse gases are from cars in the city. So I've said before to many people, I've said on debate stages, I love my car, but I got to get out of my car. We've got to figure out a way in Newton to live car light, not car free. No one's going to do that. But together as a community, our commitment to climate change, we've got to figure out a way to live car light.
Let me ask this question, and I'll ask it to Brenda, and then you can follow up if you'd like, Lisa. You're talking about a car light. It seems to me that one of the biggest disconnects in the city is not necessarily going from the city into Boston. It's getting from Newton Highlands to Newton Center to Auburndale to the lake or wherever you're going. There's not that interconnectedness. Is there in your thoughts, is there a way to address that in the future that's economically feasible to have, for example, a public-private partnership that would provide shuttles between the different villages?
So I think we're starting to address it, and I think what necessity is the mother of invention. I think we all understand we are on the clock with climate change. And for the last 8 months, I've been touting the benefits of these Lime bikes. I live in the Highlands, I work in Newton Center, I've been jumping on these Lime bikes whenever I can. And then we just learned that Lime is pulling out of Newton because they weren't financially sustainable. So we've got to keep figuring this out. Do you know what I mean? Like, is it electric shuttles? I don't know. But status quo isn't working. It's not working. We need to figure this out.
Lisa, what would give me a proposal or two about how to address what Brenda's outlined?
So I was saying this before. On another note, apparently Lime Bike is leaving, but the blue bike system's coming in, which at least when I'm knocking on doors, I think people will be happy about because they have docking stations. And for a lot of seniors, the Lime bikes being left in the sidewalks has caused a lot of problems. But I like the Numo model, and I've studied the way that they've done things, say, in Mexico City and in other countries, and it seems to me that we're very outdated in the way that we think. There seems to be, I think that we could get a vehicle, it would be wonderful for hybrid or electric, that would be an on-demand service that could bring people around to all the different villages. I know that my children would use it. They love to go over to the Marshalls Mall and the Needham Strip, and it would be fantastic if I didn't have to take the time and the gas to bring them there. So I think there's a lot we could do to really reduce traffic trips and to increase awareness amongst our residents about how to maybe make fewer car trips.
All right. Thank you very much. I have so many more questions, but we are running short on time. So we're going to start with you, Lisa. A question for Councilor Noel, and question, which is 1 or 2 sentences and not a statement. And then, Brenda, you can answer. And then we'll vice versa.
Okay, so I was just curious, and I know this came up before, that Mark Development makes a donation to your very worthy, very wonderful nonprofit, and I think that that's a wonderful thing that they do. I do think it's really important, though, as counselors, that we are accountable to our community, and that we make it very clear when we do accept a donation that may benefit us either in our professional lives or in our personal lives. So I was just wondering if you were going to recuse yourself in the future and how much of a donation they do make to your nonprofit.
So will you recuse yourself from any future votes on Mark Development, Robert Korf's company?
Andy, I don't think that was the question. I think it was more lined out about what is the process. So let me start there. So we have a state ethics board that guides us in this for good reason. These are really complicated issues. Not only are we city councilors, we're members of the community. There's issues we care about. There's boards we sit on. There's jobs we have. And the whole purpose of that ethics commission is to provide guidance. So even before I took the oath, after I won the election, I reached out to the city solicitor's office and said, let's sit down and talk about this. How am I going to have guidance to make sure I don't have any missteps? I have been in touch with them throughout. If there's any question, not only do I seek counsel, I ask for written statements on how I should be advised and what I should do. I've filed disclosures, and I feel 100% confident that I have followed their advice and guidance. And I encourage folks, the other beautiful thing you can do with your elected officials is file a FOIA request. If you want to see those interactions, you want to read my emails, file a request.
All right. Let's question from Councilor Noel to Lisa Gordon.
Oh, that's a good one. Lisa, what have you recently binge watched on Netflix?
Okay, would Amazon Prime also work?
Amazon works as well.
I will admit that I am a huge fan of British crime dramas, and I have been watching Endeavour, which I used to watch on PBS, and somehow I picked it up in the middle, so I went back and started at the beginning, and I love that question. Thank you.
I will watch that now as well.
Very good. Okay. Closing remarks, Lisa Gordon, go ahead.
Right, so I'm running on 3 main things. I believe that climate change we are at a crisis point. I believe that in the excellence of our schools, I will do everything to maintain those, and I would like to bring responsive and accountable representation to the Ward 6 seat. My name is Lisa Gordon. Please vote for me on November 5th.
Thank you, Lisa. And Councilor Noel?
So, Mr. Levin, thank you for your excellent moderation. Thank you to the Area Council for this opportunity. And also thank you to Ward 6 for your support in me in the last election. I have been honored to have the opportunity to serve you. You have made me better. I feel like this 2 years under my belt has made me a better counselor in terms of listening and learning and refining my communication and the opportunities I have to meet with you. And I have accomplished many things that I'm proud of. And I'm asking for your vote on November 5th, and I hope that you send me back to City Council.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both candidates, Lisa Gordon
Thank you.
and City Councilor Brenda Noel. We'll have